used to make these buds, the sugars used to make these buds, came from how long ago?
100 years.
60 years, 100
100
years,
years ago.
but decades, many decades, right? These trees store sugars in their wood, in cells in their wood, for decades and decades and decades. And the sugar converts to sprouts. It's the food that feeds these sprouts.
Because it's a hydrocarbon, is that what it is?
Yeah. So, the other part of the headline is that these sprouts are really old. And here's an example of that, and I'll pass this around. We have a bunch of sprouts here on the outside, and you can trace back these buds going all the way to the center when the thing was a little green bud as it was growing up the tree. The trees set aside these buds for cases like this. I'll tell you more about my work later. I study the development of these buds and the genetic consequences of doing this. But this headline is about the physiology and where the food comes from, where the buds come from. Does anyone know? So these redwood burls here at the base of the burl have these buds as well. Does anyone know when those buds develop? They develop when the seed makes its first two leaves at the earliest stage of development. Wow. The plant sets aside these buds for a rainy day or a fiery, charry day, right? And it does so automatically right at the start. When you look at planted redwood trees, you can tell if it came from a seed or a cutting rooted branch based on if you see the sprouts coming out the bottom, right? Because the sprouts are coming from the seed and developed. The first thing the seedling does is develop a set of these sprouts. I like to think of burls or sprouts like this as a branch system covered by bark. And I'll show an example of that in just a second. The scientific name for these burls are called lignotubers. A tuber is a potato, right? So an underground stem with the eyes, right? Lignin, wood. So you can think of this as woody potatoes under the ground, and we see that here on the redwood loop. Okay? And so we'll talk more about that later. But to show you what I mean by under the bark branch system, so redwoods do this at a bunch of different scales, including at this scale, where you can see all these branches coming out of a common point. You can pass that around too. Take a look at that.
It looks like a redwood. It's so smooth.
This is a redwood.
Okay.
So if you take...
I thought it was mature.
So did I.
No,
It looks like a...
it's redwood. So other plants do this as well. But redwood has some of these little dots of buds you can see underneath the bark. We might find there's a better example on this larger tree. Whenever you see a piece of wood from redwood and you see these little bumps here, these bumps here are covered by bark, right? And they come out just barely on the side here of the bark, but they're covered by bark, but they're branch systems that are above the cambium, above where the tree's growing out, and essentially little branches that advance just outside of where the new wood is being formed. So it's a branch system covered by bark. And all redwood trees do this, from the main trunks, which you see all around us here,
And those
to
little-
the small branches, right? Anywhere where we're seeing these sprouts, they're coming from little tiny protrusions coming out of the wood like this.
that are all traced back to the pith of the...
That trace
branch.
back to the pith, or when this trunk was just a little green sprig, at whatever height on the tree that was.
So that was the part that, in the article, that sort of blew the whole thing out of the water, is that the redwoods genetically are intended to be able to withstand fires. I mean,
Absolutely.
this allows for that to occur.
Absolutely.
And for
Yes.
the forest to continue to regenerate, as long as we don't clear cut, but if you let it naturally do this process,
Yes.
that is built into these redwoods
It is.
genetically.
It is.
But just with the sempervirens. The-
Yes,
Yes,
that's also
no,
right.
The
not-
coast redwood.
Yeah,
only the
giant
coast red.
sequoia doesn't do quite
They
like
have
this.
other cool.
So Zane, there's a
Yeah.
big burrow on the Redwood Loop Walk where it comes off, and
By-
there used to be
right before the father?
There used to be growing around a
Oh, the
Tano.
Tano.
tan oak,
Mm.
and that was always just smooth.
Yeah,
And
now
after the
it's,
fire,
yep, now it's growing.
it started
sprouting.
sprouting
It's
all of
sprouted.
these. So is it sprouting from the roots the same way that epicormic would be sprouting?
Yeah, so not from the roots, from this underground potato,
yeah,
right? The
yeah.
lignotuber, right? Not, which is sort of a cross between a stem. It's sort of a stem-ish thing. It's not a root. Definitely not a root. The sprouts are coming from stems. So you can think of these sprouts as branches, as the same as these bottle brush epicormic branches coming out from the base
Lignotubers.
of the tree. Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah. And so we'll look at that on the loop.
Yes, that's the permanent wave tree.
I don't call
Yes.
it a permanent stupid name. I'm sorry.
Okay,
Yeah,
We'll have
So-
to separate you two.
so I think we can
it the
we can
lava
head around the
flow.
loop, and I want to answer questions. We'll talk about so we'll talk about from a genetic point of view what happens to the cells of a redwood tree in the branches, and we'll talk about all of that.
So
some of
before
my
we move on though,
dissertation. Yeah.